Hi, my name is Britney Gomez. I'm 29 years old, and last Tuesday I discovered that my own family had already spent my $847,000 inheritance while I was still very much alive. Then watched the IRS destroy every single one of them when their greed finally caught up. You see, 3 months ago, I was sitting in Dr. Patterson's office in Riverside Medical Center, staring at test results that would change everything. The words, aggressive lymphoma, hung in the air like a death sentence. Stage 3. Treatment options? Limited. 6 months, maybe 8 if I was lucky, the doctor said with that practiced sympathy they teach in medical school. My hands trembled as I signed forms for experimental treatment, knowing the odds were stacked against me. But here's what I didn't know. While I was fighting for my life in chemotherapy sessions at Riverside, my family was already planning my funeral. Not just planning it, but spending the money they'd inherit from it. My Aunt Victoria had always been the family's unofficial financial advisor, sharp-eyed, sliver-haired, with a way of making everyone feel like children who couldn't possibly understand real money matters. She'd managed my grandmother's estate, my father's business dealings, and somehow convinced everyone she had some sort of Midas touch. What I discovered was that her golden touch was really just sticky fingers. It started small, or so I thought. During my second round of chemo, Victoria suggested I sign some papers to streamline things in case the treatments didn't work. Power of attorney documents, she called them. Just temporary, just to make sure my medical bills got paid if I couldn't handle them myself. Her daughter, Carmen, my cousin, witnessed the signatures with tears in her eyes, telling me how brave I was being, how she'd take care of everything. I was exhausted, barely able to keep food down, my hair falling out in clumps, and all I wanted was to focus on surviving. So I signed. God help me, I signed everything they put in front of me. The first red flag should have been the Mercedes. Carmen picked me up for a doctor's appointment in a brand new silver E-Class, leather seats still smelling like the showroom. When I asked about it, she laughed it off. Finally treating myself, she said. Life's too short, you know? The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, literally fighting for more life while she was spending like there was no tomorrow. Then came the renovations. Victoria's modest ranch house in Elmwood suddenly sprouted a second story complete with marble countertops and a wine cellar. Insurance settlement from the storm damage, she explained when I noticed during a family dinner I could barely stomach. But there hadn't been any storm damage. I remembered that house perfectly. It was the same house where I'd spent countless summer afternoons as a kid helping Victoria tend her rose garden. My brother Jake started showing up to my treatments in designer clothes, talking about his new investment opportunities. My sister Nina suddenly had a new wardrobe that would make a Hollywood stylist jealous. Even my teenage nephew Tyler was sporting the latest iPhone and talking about his college fund being fully covered now. But the moment that should have opened my eyes came during what I thought was a family meeting about my care. We were gathered in Victoria's renovated living room, me wrapped in blankets and barely able to sit upright, when I heard my sister Nina whisper to Carmen, "How much longer do you think we have to keep this up?" Carmen shushed her quickly, but I heard it. I heard it, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the chemotherapy. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. Cancer does things to your mind, makes you suspicious, makes you see threats where there might just be coincidences. These were my family members. They'd been visiting me in the hospital, bringing me soup, holding my hand during the worst days. Surely they weren't... The truth came crashing down on a Thursday afternoon in November. I was feeling stronger. The experimental treatment was actually working, my latest scans showing the tumor shrinking, when I decided to surprise Victoria with a visit. I had good news to share, hope to offer, maybe even plans to make for a future I was beginning to believe in again. I found her in her home office, surrounded by bank statements and investment portfolios spread across her mahogany desk like a war room. She didn't hear me come in through the side door she always left unlocked. What I saw made my recovering body go completely numb. There, in black and white, were withdrawal slips from accounts I recognized. My accounts. My inheritance from my parents, the life insurance policies they'd left me, even the small trust fund my grandmother had set up. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved systematically over the past 3 months, transferred, spent, invested, and scattered across a dozen different accounts and purchases.
Victoria was on the phone, her back to me, discussing estate management strategies with someone who sounded like a financial advisor. The beneficiary won't be needing these funds. We're looking at maybe 4 more months, tops. The doctors are just being optimistic to keep her spirits up. 4 more months. She was talking about me like I was already dead. But what came next made my blood turn to ice. Because Victoria wasn't just stealing my money, she was preparing to claim a life insurance payout that would only come if I died. And sitting right there on her desk was a medical report I'd never seen before. One that painted my prognosis as far worse than anything my actual doctors had told me.
That's when I realized this wasn't just theft. This was something much darker. They hadn't just spent my inheritance while I was sick. They'd been counting on me dying to cover their tracks. And now that I was getting better, I was becoming a problem they hadn't planned for. What I discovered next would prove that their greed had created a paper trail so obvious that even the IRS couldn't ignore it. And when the government gets involved in family business, nobody comes out unscathed. I thought surviving cancer would be the hardest fight of my life. I had no idea the real battle was just beginning. I stood frozen in Victoria's doorway, my hands still gripping the brass handle, watching my aunt shuffle through what I now realized were my financial documents like she owned them. The experimental treatment had been working. I was supposed to be getting stronger, supposed to be beating this thing. But standing there, seeing months of systematic theft laid out across her desk, I felt sicker than I ever had during chemotherapy. Victoria's voice drifted across the room as she continued her phone conversation, completely unaware of my presence. Yes, the original projections were accurate, she was saying, pen tapping against a spreadsheet covered in red ink. The medical team confirmed it won't be much longer. We can finalize the insurance claims by spring. Insurance claims for my death, while I was standing 10 feet away from her, very much alive and getting healthier by the day. I took a step into the room, and that's when I saw it clearly, a medical file with my name on it, but the prognosis inside was nothing like what Dr. Patterson had been telling me. This document painted a picture of someone with weeks to live, someone whose condition was rapidly deteriorating, someone who had no hope of recovery. The letterhead was from Westfield Medical Associates, a clinic I'd never even heard of, signed by a Dr. Richard Hayworth, whose name meant nothing to me. My vision blurred, not from illness this time, but from pure rage. They had falsified medical records to justify their spending spree. "Victoria," I said, my voice cutting through her phone conversation like a knife. She spun around in her leather chair, her face cycling through surprise, panic, and then something that looked almost like disappointment, like she was frustrated that I'd interrupted her business meeting about my own death. "Britney, sweetheart." She hung up quickly, sweeping the papers toward herself in a motion that was far too casual to be innocent. "How are you feeling? You look better. Much better, actually." "I am better," I said, stepping fully into the room. "My scans came back clear on Tuesday. The tumors are shrinking. Dr. Patterson says if this continues, I might be in full remission within 6 months. For just a second, Victoria's mask slipped completely. Instead of joy, instead of relief that her niece might actually survive cancer, I saw something that looked like panic flash across her face. Pure, undiluted panic. That's wonderful news, honey," she said, but her voice sounded hollow. "Really? Wonderful. We should celebrate." "We should," I agreed, moving closer to the desk. "Maybe we could use some of my inheritance money for that celebration. You know, the inheritance you've been managing while I've been sick." Victoria's hands tightened on the papers. "Now, Britney, you know I've only been trying to protect your interests, making sure your money was working for you, not just sitting in some low-interest account while you focused on getting better." "Protect my interests?" I laughed, and even to my own ears, it sounded bitter. "Is that what you call buying Carmen a Mercedes? Renovating your house? Setting up Tyler's college fund? Protecting my interests by spending every dollar I had?" "You don't understand the complexities of financial management," Victoria said, standing up from her chair with that same condescending tone she'd used when I was 12 and asking about why adults get to make all the decisions.
Everything I've done has been with your best interests in mind. When the doctors thought you might not, when the doctors thought I might die, I finished for her. Except that's not what my doctors said, is it, Victoria? Dr. Patterson has been cautiously optimistic for weeks now. But this report here, I snatched the fake medical file from her desk, this says I'm dying. This says I have no hope of recovery. This is signed by a doctor I've never met from a clinic I've never been to. Victoria reached for the file, but I held it away from her. Britney, please let me explain. Explain how you forged medical documents. Explain how you've stolen over $800,000 from someone you thought was dying. Explain how you've been planning my funeral while I've been fighting to live. The room fell silent except for the sound of both of us breathing hard. Victoria's perfectly composed facade finally cracked completely. You were supposed to die, she whispered, and the words hit me like a physical blow. The first diagnosis, the doctors at Riverside, they said 6 months, 8 at most. I was just trying to make sure the money didn't get tied up in probate, that it could be used to help the family through the grief, to take care of final expenses. Final expenses? I held up a bank statement that showed a $45,000 withdrawal labeled home improvements. This was for final expenses?
Victoria's jaw tightened. You have no idea how expensive it is to manage an estate, to handle all the details when someone might inconveniently survive, I asked. Is that the problem here, Victoria? That I'm not dying fast enough for your financial timeline? Her eyes flashed with something ugly. Don't be dramatic. You're sick, Britney. You're not thinking clearly. The stress, the medications, they're affecting your judgment. Why don't you go home, rest, and we can discuss this when you're feeling more stable? That's when I knew. Looking at my aunt's face, seeing the calculation behind her eyes, I realized this wasn't just theft. This was something much more sinister. They hadn't just spent my inheritance hoping I'd die. They'd been counting on it. And now that I was recovering, I wasn't just a disappointment. I was a threat. You're right about one thing, Victoria, I said, backing toward the door with the fake medical report still clutched in my hand. I'm not thinking clearly, because if I was thinking clearly, I would have realized months ago that my own family was praying for me to die so they could afford their new lifestyle. I turned to leave, but Victoria's voice stopped me cold. Britney, wait. You can't just... We need to discuss this rationally. There are legal implications here, tax consequences you don't understand. If you go making accusations, if you involve outside parties, this could get very complicated for everyone. I looked back at her, this woman who had held my hand during chemo, who had brought me soup when I couldn't keep anything down, who had cried with me when the first diagnosis came in. And I realized that every tear, every gesture of comfort, every moment of supposed support had been an act. Complicated, I repeated. Victoria, I think it's about to get very simple, because I'm going to find out exactly where every penny of my money went, and then I'm going to make sure everyone involved pays it back with interest. As I walked out of that house, clutching evidence of their betrayal in my shaking hands, I had no idea that their financial crimes had created a paper trail so obvious, so sloppy, and so illegal that I wouldn't be the only one seeking justice. The IRS was about to take a very close look at the Gomez family finances. And when the government decides your tax returns don't add up, prison sentences tend to follow. The drive home from Victoria's house was a blur of traffic lights and stop signs that I barely registered. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel of my old Honda Civic, a car that suddenly felt like a monument to my stupidity. While I'd been driving this 15-year-old beater with its rattling exhaust and broken air conditioning, my family had been cruising around in vehicles I had unknowingly purchased for them. I pulled into the driveway of my small rental apartment on Maple Street, a modest one-bedroom place I'd moved into after the cancer diagnosis to be closer to the medical center. The rent was $1,200 a month, and I'd been stretching every dollar, buying generic groceries and skipping meals to make ends meet while paying for treatments that insurance only partially covered. Meanwhile, my family had been living like lottery winners on my stolen inheritance. Inside my apartment, I spread the fake medical report across my tiny kitchen table, next to a stack of my actual medical records. The contrast was staggering. Dr. Patterson's real reports showed cautious optimism, steady improvement, shrinking tumors. Dr. Hayworth's fabricated file painted me as essentially a walking corpse, someone whose death was not just inevitable, but imminent. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Hey, cuz, how did your appointment go today? Thinking of you. Red heart." I stared at that heart emoji until my vision blurred. How long had she been sending me these supportive messages while simultaneously planning how to spend my death money? How many times had she hugged me in the hospital waiting room while mentally calculating Mercedes payments? The apartment felt suffocating. I walked to my bathroom mirror and looked at myself, really looked at myself, for the first time in months. The face staring back was gaunt but alive. My hair was growing back in soft brown wisps. My cheeks had color again. I was surviving. I was healing. And that was apparently the worst news my family had received all year. Another text, this one from Jake. "Victoria mentioned you stopped by today. She seemed worried about you. You okay, sis?" Victoria seemed worried. Of course she did. She was probably terrified that her carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. I wondered how long it took her to call the family meeting after I left, how quickly they'd huddled together to discuss the Britney problem. I sat down on my secondhand couch and started making calculations. $847,000. That was more than most people made in a decade. My parents had been careful savers, conservative investors who'd built that nest egg over 30 years of marriage. They died in a car accident 2 years ago, trusting that their youngest daughter would be taken care of, that their life's work would give me security and opportunity. Instead, it had been treated like a carnival prize, grabbed and distributed among family members who had apparently been just waiting for me to join my parents in the ground. My phone rang. Victoria's name flashed on the screen.
"Brittany, sweetheart, I've been thinking about our conversation today." Her voice was honey smooth, practiced. "I realize I may not have explained things as clearly as I should have. Why don't you come over tomorrow? I'll make that lemon chicken you used to love, and we can go through everything together. Show you exactly how your money has been invested and managed." "Invested and managed," I repeated slowly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "Honey, you're understandably upset. The medication, the stress, it's natural to feel confused about complex financial matters. But I want you to understand that everything I've done has been to protect you and secure your future." The gaslighting was so smooth, so professional. How many times had she used this exact tone with elderly clients before she decided to turn her talents on her dying niece? "Victoria, I saw Carmen's Mercedes. I saw your house renovations. I saw Tyler's college fund statements. I saw Jake's new wardrobe and Nina's shopping sprees. What exactly about any of that was securing my future?" A pause. "Then, those were necessary expenditures from the estate management budget, administrative costs, if you will. Managing large sums of money requires infrastructure, proper vehicles for transportation to meetings, appropriate spaces for conducting financial business. You turned my inheritance into your personal ATM, and you're calling it administrative costs? I'm calling it responsible estate planning." Her voice was getting harder now, losing the honey coating. "Something you're clearly too emotional to understand right now. I think we need to involve Dr. Patterson in this conversation. Get his professional opinion on whether you're competent to make these kinds of financial decisions while you're still undergoing treatment." There it was, the threat beneath the concern. She was going to try to have me declared incompetent, use my cancer diagnosis against me to maintain control of money she'd already stolen. You do that, Victoria. You call Dr. Patterson. And while you're at it, maybe you can explain to him why there's a medical report with my name on it from a doctor I've never met, declaring me terminal when his actual patient is showing signs of remission. The line went quiet. I could almost hear her calculating, trying to figure out how much trouble she was actually in. I don't know what you think you saw today, Britney, but grief and medication can play tricks on a person's perception. Why don't you rest tonight and we'll sort this all out tomorrow like a family should. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in the growing darkness of my tiny apartment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed listening to the neighbors upstairs watching television, thinking about how my family had probably been planning my funeral while I was still receiving treatments. Had they already picked out a casket, chosen the flowers, decided who would speak at my memorial service about what a brave fighter I had been? The thought made my stomach turn. Every visit to the hospital, every "how are you feeling today, sweetheart?" every concerned phone call, it had all been performance. They'd been mourning me while I was still alive, not because they loved me, but because they needed me dead to justify their spending. Around 3 a.m., another text came in from an unknown number. "This is Dr. Hayworth from Westfield Medical Associates. I understand there's been some confusion about your medical records. Could you please call my office at your earliest convenience? We need to discuss some important matters regarding your case." I screenshotted the message immediately. Dr. Hayworth, the fictional doctor whose name was on my fake death sentence, was now trying to contact me directly. Either Victoria worked faster than I had given her credit for, or this conspiracy ran deeper than just family greed. I spent the rest of the night researching Westfield Medical Associates online. The clinic existed, but Dr. Richard Hayworth wasn't listed on their staff directory. In fact, when I dug deeper into medical licensing databases, there was no Dr. Richard Hayworth license to practice in our state at all. My family hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd created an entire fictional medical scenario to justify it, with a fake doctor who was now trying to contact me to clarify records that should never have existed in the first place. As dawn broke through my bedroom window, I realized I wasn't just dealing with theft. I was dealing with fraud, forgery, and possibly conspiracy. And if they were willing to go this far to cover their tracks now that I knew the truth, what else might they do to protect their secret now that I knew the truth? I was supposed to be fighting cancer. Instead, I was about to go to war with the people who were supposed to love me most. But as I sat there watching the sunrise paint my walls gold, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months of illness and treatment. Pure, focused determination. They'd counted me out too early, and now they were about to learn exactly what a survivor was capable of when she had nothing left to lose. Sitting at my kitchen table the next morning with a cup of instant coffee and a growing pile of evidence, I realized this wasn't the first time my family had treated me like I was disposable. The inheritance theft was just the latest, most devastating chapter in a book that had been written long before I ever got sick. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through old photos, looking for clues I'd been too naive or too hopeful to recognize at the time. There it was, Christmas morning, 3 years ago. The family gathered around Victoria's tree, everyone holding expensive gifts except me. I remember that day clearly now. Victoria had handed me a $25 Target gift card, while Jake unwrapped a new laptop, and Nina squealed over designer boots that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "It's the thought that counts," Victoria had said when she saw my face. "Besides, you're so practical, Britney. You don't need all these frivolous things like the others do." Practical. That had been their code word for expendable. I kept scrolling, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. My college graduation. I was the only family member who'd paid for their own education, while Jake's tuition had been covered by a mysterious scholarship that I now realized had probably been family money. My graduation party had been a small dinner at a chain restaurant, while Nina's high school graduation 6 months later was celebrated with a catered backyard party that cost thousands. Even my parents' funerals showed the same pattern. I'd handled all the arrangements, paid for the flowers, organized the reception, while my siblings focused on grieving. Victoria had patted my shoulder and said, "You're so strong, Britney, so capable. It's wonderful that you can take care of all these details while the rest of us fall apart." I'd been proud of that strength at the time,
Now I understood it differently. I hadn't been the strong one. I'd been the convenient one, the one they could dump responsibility on while they preserved their energy for more important things, like figuring out how to access my parents' life insurance policies. My phone buzzed with a call from my best friend, Rachel, who lived across the country in Portland. We'd been close since college, but the distance and my recent health struggles had made regular contact difficult. Britt, how are you feeling? I've been thinking about you constantly since your last update about the treatment going well. Hearing Rachel's voice, someone who genuinely cared about my well-being without any financial motive, almost broke me. Rachel, I need to tell you something, and you're going to think I'm losing my mind. I told her everything. The fake medical records, the stolen inheritance, Victoria's threats, the mysterious Dr. Hayworth. Rachel listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief or outrage. Jesus Christ, Brittany, she said when I finished. I always knew your family treated you like the designated responsible one, but this is actual theft. This is criminal. What do you mean you always knew? Rachel was quiet for a moment. Do you remember when you came to visit me 2 summers ago? You were stressed about Nina's wedding expenses, and you mentioned that the family expected you to contribute even though you were already struggling with your own bills. I remembered. Nina wanted a destination wedding in Cabo, and somehow it had become my responsibility to help make that happen because I was good with budgets and didn't have my own wedding to save for. I told you then that it wasn't normal, the way they always expected you to be the one who sacrificed, who made things work, who cleaned up everyone else's messes. But you kept saying, that's just how families operate, and everyone has their role. I didn't push it because you seemed to believe that was normal. Normal. I'd convinced myself that being the family fixer was normal, that being overlooked in favor of my flashier siblings was just birth order dynamics. I'd normalized my own exploitation because the alternative, accepting that my family might not actually love me, was too painful to consider. There's something else, Rachel said carefully. Do you remember telling me about the family investment club that Victoria started a few years back? My blood ran cold. I'd forgotten about that completely. The one where everyone pooled money for better returns than individual savings accounts? Right. And you said you couldn't participate because you didn't have extra money to invest, but everyone else was putting in thousands. You were actually embarrassed about it. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The Family Investment Club had been launched right around the time my parents died, when the insurance payouts and inheritance would have been processed. My siblings had been investing my own money while I struggled to pay rent. Oh my God, they've been doing this for years. The investment club, Nina's wedding contributions, Jake's business loan that I co-signed, even Tyler's orthodontics that I helped pay for because Carmen was in between jobs. It was all my money, wasn't it? They've been spending my inheritance piecemeal since my parents died, and the cancer diagnosis just gave them an excuse to take whatever was left. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Britt, you need to document everything. Every loan you co-signed, every family expense you contributed to, every time they asked you to help with something while claiming they couldn't afford it themselves. I started making a list, and it grew longer and more infuriating with each entry. Carmen's emergency car repair that I had paid for while she drove around in a luxury SUV I apparently purchased, Victoria's roof replacement that I'd contributed $5,000 towards, not knowing that she had just added an entire second story to her house, Jake's business startup costs that I helped cover, unaware that his new consulting firm was operating out of a downtown office space that cost more per month than most people's mortgages. They'd turned me into an ATM, but they'd been clever about it. Never one big ask, never an obvious theft. Just a steady stream of family emergencies and temporary hardships that required my help while they lived lavishly on money that legally belonged to me.
The worst part, I told Rachel, is that they made me feel guilty for not being able to contribute more. When I couldn't help with Tyler's college fund, Victoria actually said I was being selfish, that family should come first even when money is tight. They turned your generosity against you, Rachel said. Classic financial abuse. Make the victim feel responsible for solving problems they're actually creating. As we talked, I realized the psychological manipulation had been as systematic as the financial theft. Every time I'd expressed doubt or asked questions, they'd responded with guilt trips about family loyalty or concerns about my mental health. When I'd struggled financially, they'd positioned it as a personal failing rather than the natural result of subsidizing their lifestyle. "There's one more thing I need to check," I told Rachel. "Victoria has been doing my taxes since my parents died, said it was too complicated for me to handle alone, and she could get me better returns with her accountant." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. "Brittany, if she's been filing your taxes and managing your inheritance simultaneously, there's going to be a paper trail that IRS can follow. Tax fraud, unreported income, false deductions. The federal government doesn't mess around with that stuff." That night, I called Victoria's accountant, a man named David Chen, who'd been doing the family's taxes for years. I told him I needed copies of my tax returns for the past 3 years for insurance purposes. "I'm sorry, Miss Gomez," he said, sounding confused, "but I don't have any tax returns for you. Mrs. Victoria handles all your filings through a different firm. She told me you preferred to use your own accountant since your financial situation was complicated after your parents' passing." Another lie, another piece of a puzzle that was revealing a picture more criminal than I'd imagined. Victoria hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She'd been hiding it from the IRS, filing fraudulent returns and potentially committing tax evasion on a massive scale. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my family's greed was about to destroy them in ways they never could have anticipated. Because while they'd been counting on me dying quietly, they'd forgotten one crucial detail. The federal government always gets its money, and when it doesn't, people go to prison. Understanding how I'd survived 30 years of being treated like an unpaid family employee required me to examine the elaborate mental gymnastics I'd performed to make sense of my treatment. Sitting in my apartment that evening, I started writing down every excuse I'd made for them, every way I'd rationalized being the family doormat, and I was horrified by what I'd discovered. I'd become an expert at making myself invisible when it mattered and indispensable when they needed something. It was a survival strategy I'd perfected without even realizing I was doing it. Take family gatherings, for example. I'd learn to arrive early and help with preparations, then fade into the background once the real family members showed up. I'd position myself near the kitchen so I could refill drinks and clear plates, giving myself a purpose that didn't require anyone to actually acknowledge my presence. When conversations turned to family achievements or exciting news, I'd find reasons to step outside or check on something in another room. The psychology behind it was devastatingly simple. If I made myself useful enough, they'd have to keep me around. If I stayed quiet enough, they couldn't complain about me. If I never asked for anything, they'd never have to say no. I'd turned self-erasure into an art form. My phone rang, interrupting my dark inventory of survival mechanisms. It was Carmen, and for a moment I considered not answering, but I realized this might be an opportunity to understand just how deep their deception ran. "Brittany, thank God you picked up. Victoria told me about your visit yesterday, and I'm really worried about you." Her voice had that carefully modulated concern that I now recognize as completely artificial. "She said you seemed confused about some financial things, and I just want you to know that we're all here for you." "Confused," I repeated. "That's an interesting word choice." Carmen: "Well, with everything you've been through with the cancer and the medications, it's completely understandable that complex financial matters might seem overwhelming. Victoria is just trying to protect you from unnecessary stress while you focus on getting better." There it was, the same gaslighting script Victoria had used, delivered with the practice ease of someone who'd been using it for years. How many times had they discussed my confusion and overwhelming stress as justification for managing my life without my input? "Carmen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. When you bought your Mercedes, where did the money come from?" A pause that lasted just a beat too long. "I've been saving for years. You know I'm careful with money." $45,000 on your part-time income from the boutique? "I had some investments pay off. Look, I don't understand why you're questioning everyone's finances all of a sudden. It's not like you to be so suspicious." Suspicious. Another loaded word designed to make me feel guilty for asking basic questions about my own money. "Do you remember when I co-signed that loan for you 3 years ago? The one for your emergency dental work that cost $8,000?
Of course I remember, and I'm so grateful that you helped me out when I was in a tough spot. I don't know what I would have done without you.
Carmen, I've been thinking about that. $8,000 for dental work is a lot of money. What kind of procedure was it? It was complicated. Multiple root canals, crown work. You know how expensive dental procedures can be. I pulled up her Facebook photos from that time period on my laptop while we talked. There she was, 3 years ago, smiling broadly in dozens of photos with perfectly straight, white teeth. No signs of recent dental work, no period of recovery, no visible changes to her smile at all. Carmen, I'm looking at your photos from that time period, and your teeth look exactly the same as they do now. Photos don't show everything, Britt. Some dental work is internal, not cosmetic. The lies came so easily, delivered with such practiced sincerity. This wasn't desperate improvisation. This was a refined system they'd been using on me for years. Here's what I think happened, I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. I think you needed money for something, and you knew I'd help if you said it was a medical emergency. Because I always helped with medical emergencies, didn't I? I was the family emergency fund. That's not... you're always so generous, and we all appreciate it, but it's not like we ever forced you to help. You're right. You never forced me. You just made sure I felt like a bad person if I didn't help. Remember when Tyler needed money for that school trip and Victoria said it would be terrible if he was the only kid who couldn't go because his family didn't support his education? Tyler's trip was important for his development. Tyler's trip cost $2,000, Carmen. $2,000 that I scraped together by skipping meals and selling my grandmother's jewelry. And now I find out that Tyler's college fund is fully funded, has been for years, probably with my own inheritance money. I could hear Carmen breathing on the other end of the line, probably trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation without admitting anything incriminating. Britt, I'm looking at your photos from that time period, and your teeth look exactly the same as they do now. Photos don't show everything, Britt. Some dental work is internal, not cosmetic. The lies came so easily, delivered with such practiced sincerity. This wasn't desperate improvisation. This was a refined system they'd been using on me for years. Here's what I think happened, I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. I think you needed money for something, and you knew I'd help if you said it was a medical emergency. Because I always helped with medical emergencies, didn't I? I was the family emergency fund. That's not... you're always so generous, and we all appreciate it, but it's not like we ever forced you to help. You're right. You never forced me. You just made sure I felt like a bad person if I didn't help. Remember when Tyler needed money for that school trip and Victoria said it would be terrible if he was the only kid who couldn't go because his family didn't support his education? Tyler's trip was important for his development. Tyler's trip cost $2,000, Carmen. $2,000 that I scraped together by skipping meals and selling my grandmother's jewelry. And now I find out that Tyler's college fund is fully funded, has been for years, probably with my own inheritance money. I could hear Carmen breathing on the other end of the line, probably trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation without admitting anything incriminating. Britt, I think you're connecting dots that don't actually connect. You're looking for patterns that aren't there because you're scared and sick and looking for someone to blame for how unfair life has been. There it was, the ultimate gaslighting move. Turned my legitimate questions into symptoms of psychological instability caused by my illness. Let me ask you one more question, Carmen. When you found out I was responding well to treatment, that I might actually survive this cancer, how did that make you feel? The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. What kind of question is that? She finally said, but her voice had lost its warm concern and taken on something harder. Of course I want you to get better. We all do.
Do you? Because Victoria seemed pretty disappointed when I told her my scans were clear. She seemed like someone who'd been expecting different news. I think this conversation has gone far enough. You're obviously not in a good headspace right now, and I don't want to say something we'll both regret. Why don't you call me when you're feeling more like yourself? She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone and realizing that feeling more like myself meant going back to being the compliant, unquestioning family ATM who never asked inconvenient questions. But as I sat there in my quiet apartment, I understood something crucial about my own psychology. I hadn't just been naive or generous. I'd been systematically conditioned. Every time I'd tried to assert boundaries or ask questions, they'd responded with concerns about my mental health, my stress levels, my ability to handle complex situations. They'd trained me to doubt my own perceptions and deferred their judgment. The cancer had actually been a gift to them in that regard. It gave them the perfect excuse to dismiss any resistance I might offer as illness-related confusion. How convenient that their long-term victim had developed a life-threatening disease that justified treating her like she was incompetent to manage her own affairs. I had survived 30 years of psychological manipulation by convincing myself that being needed was the same as being loved. I'd mistaken exploitation for family loyalty, financial abuse for protective care. I'd transformed my own erasure into a virtue, telling myself that my self-sacrifice made me the strong one, the reliable one, the mature one. The truth was much simpler and more devastating. I'd been the convenient one, the one they could count on to solve problems, provide money, and ask no questions. And when I finally started asking questions, they tried to convince me that curiosity itself was a symptom of my illness. But sitting there in my small apartment, surrounded by evidence of years of systematic theft and deception, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 decades. Complete clarity about who my family really was and what they'd done to me.
My first stop was Riverside Community Bank, where my parents had maintained their accounts for over 20 years. I'd been added as a beneficiary on their accounts after they died, but Victoria had convinced me to let her handle the complex estate transfers while I focused on my health. Now, I wanted to see exactly what those transfers had looked like. The bank manager, Mrs. Hendricks, was a woman in her 50s who remembered my parents fondly. When I explained that I needed to review the estate account activity, her expression shifted from friendly to concerned. Ms. Gomez, I have to tell you, there's been some unusual activity on these accounts that's been flagged by our fraud detection system. We've actually been trying to reach you for weeks. My stomach dropped. What kind of unusual activity? She pulled up my file on her computer, frowning at the screen. Large cash withdrawals, wire transfers to accounts we can't verify, and several checks written to what appear to be shell companies. The signature authorization shows your power of attorney, but the spending patterns are concerning. Shell companies? Elmwood Property Management, Riverside Investment Solutions, Gomez Family Trust Services. Do any of those sound familiar to you? I shook my head, feeling sick. I've never heard of any of them. Mrs. Hendricks turned her monitor toward me, and I saw a list of transactions that made my head spin. $50,000 to Elmwood Property Management, $30,000 to Riverside Investment Solutions, $75,000 to Gomez Family Trust Services, all authorized with my supposed signature, all dated after my cancer diagnosis. The thing is, Ms. Hendricks continued, we ran these company names through our verification system, and none of them exist. They're not registered businesses in this state. The bank accounts they were transferred to were opened with fake documentation and closed within days of receiving the funds. So, someone created fake companies to steal my inheritance? That's what it looks like. And Miss Gomez, I have to ask, did you actually authorize your Aunt Victoria to make these transfers? Because the signature on the authorization documents doesn't quite match your signature on file.
She showed me the power of attorney paperwork I'd supposedly signed. The signature was close to mine, but not quite right. Someone had been practicing my handwriting, but they hadn't perfected it. "This isn't my signature," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "and I never authorize any transfers to companies I'd never heard of." Mrs. Hendricks nodded grimly. I was afraid of that. "Miss Gomez, what you're describing is bank fraud, identity theft, and forgery. We're going to need to file a report with the authorities, and I'd recommend you contact a lawyer immediately." I left the bank with a thick folder of documentation and a growing understanding that this wasn't just family theft. It was sophisticated financial crime. Victoria hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she'd created an entire network of fake businesses to launder the money and hide the paper trail. My next stop was the county clerk's office to research the business registrations Mrs. Hendricks had mentioned. The clerk, a bored-looking young man named Peter, helped me search the database for Elmwood Property Management, Riverside Investment Solutions, and Gomez Family Trust Services. "Nothing," he said, looking at his screen. "None of these businesses are registered in this county. Want me to check the state database?" 20 minutes later, he confirmed what I'd suspected. No state registrations either. These companies don't exist, at least not legally. But Peter had an idea. Sometimes people use registered agent services to hide business ownership. Let me check the addresses associated with these bank transfers. He pulled up property records for the addresses listed on the fraudulent bank transfers. My blood ran cold as I read the results. The address for Elmwood Property Management was Victoria's house. Riverside Investment Solutions was registered to Carmen's apartment complex. Gomez Family Trust Services listed Jake's downtown loft as its business address. They'd been so arrogant, so confident that I'd never investigate, that they'd use their own addresses for their fake businesses. It was like they'd wanted to get caught. "This is interesting," Peter said, pulling up more records. "Looks like there have been some significant property improvements at these addresses over the past year. New construction permits, renovation licenses, stuff like that." He showed me the permits. Victoria's second-story addition, Carmen's apartment complex pool renovation that she had mentioned as a building improvement that increased her rent, Jake's loft renovation that had apparently added a rooftop terrace and upgraded all the fixtures. They had used my stolen inheritance to improve their own properties and then claimed the improvements as legitimate expenses through their fake businesses. It was a money laundering operation masquerading as family financial management. I thanked Peter and drove to my next destination, the office of Leonard Walsh, a tax attorney Rachel had recommended. I'd called that morning and explained the basics, and he'd agreed to see me immediately. Walsh was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of serious demeanor that made you trust him instantly. I spread out all my documentation across his conference table: bank statements, property records, business searches, the fake medical report, power of attorney documents with forged signatures. He reviewed everything in silence for nearly an hour, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and excitement. "Miss Gomez, what you've uncovered here is one of the most comprehensive financial fraud cases I've seen in 20 years of practice. We're talking about federal crimes, wire fraud, mail fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy." Federal crimes?
When money crosses state lines or involves fake businesses, it becomes a federal matter. And the amounts involved here, we're talking about felony charges that carry serious prison time. He picked up the bank statements. But here's the thing that's really going to destroy them. They've been spending your inheritance without paying taxes on it. I didn't understand. What do you mean? When someone receives a large inheritance, they're supposed to report it to the IRS. When they spend that money on property improvements, luxury purchases, or investments, those expenditures need to be properly documented and taxed. Your family has been living like millionaires while reporting middle-class incomes to the federal government. Walsh pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Carmen works part-time at a boutique, but she's purchased a $45,000 car and made significant improvements to her living situation. Jake claims to be a small business consultant, but he's living in a downtown loft that costs more per month than most people make in a year. Victoria's supposed to be retired on a fixed income, but she's added a second story to her house. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The IRS is going to audit them? Miss Gomez, the IRS is going to do more than audit them. When we report this fraud and provide this documentation, they're going to launch a criminal investigation. And when the federal government investigates financial crimes of this magnitude, they don't just want their money back, they want people to go to prison. Walsh leaned back in his chair, looking almost pleased. Your family thought they were stealing from you. What they actually did was steal from the United States government. And the government always collects its debts, one way or another. As I left Walsh's office that afternoon, I realized that my family's greed had set in motion a chain of events they couldn't control or manipulate. They'd spent years conditioning me to be compliant and unquestioning, but they'd forgotten one crucial detail. The federal government doesn't care about family dynamics or emotional manipulation. The IRS was about to give them an education in consequences that no amount of gaslighting could prevent. Armed with evidence of federal crimes and a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud, I decided it was time to give my family one last chance to come clean before I handed everything over to the authorities. I wasn't doing this out of kindness. I was doing this to see exactly how deep their deception ran, and whether they'd double down on their lives even when faced with irrefutable proof. I called a family meeting for Sunday dinner at Victoria's house, the same house that had been renovated with my stolen inheritance. When I arrived, I was struck by details I'd somehow missed before. The marble countertops in the kitchen weren't just expensive, they were the exact same Carrara marble my mother had always dreamed of but could never afford. The hardwood floors weren't just refinished, they were completely new Brazilian cherry, the kind you see in luxury homes featured in magazines. Victoria literally built her dream home with my parents' money that was supposed to secure my future after they were gone. Everyone was already there when I walked in, Victoria bustling around in the kitchen, Carmen scrolling through her phone, Jake watching a football game on a television screen that was easily 75 inches of pure luxury electronics, Nina was painting her nails at the dining room table, and Tyler was playing some expensive-looking handheld gaming device. The scene looked like a family gathering, but I now saw it for what it really was, a group of co-conspirators enjoying the fruits of their theft. "Britney, you look so much better," Victoria called from the kitchen, her voice bright with forced cheer. "I'm making that pot roast you used to love when you were little. Are you feeling up to eating solid food?" Even her concern was condescending. I was a grown woman who'd been managing her own meals for months, but she spoke to me like I was a child recovering from a stomach bug. "I'm feeling much better, actually, clear-headed for the first time in months. Which is why I think it's time we had an honest conversation about my inheritance." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees instantly. Jake muted the television, Carmen put down her phone, and Victoria stopped stirring whatever was on the stove. "What about your inheritance, sweetheart?" Victoria asked carefully. I opened my briefcase and started laying out documents. Bank statements, property records, business registration searches, the forged power of attorney paperwork. "I think you know exactly what about my inheritance." Victoria walked over to the table, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and glanced at the papers. Her composure didn't crack, but I saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what you think you found, but I can assure you that everything I have done with your financial affairs has been completely legal and in your best interest." "Legal?" I pulled out the business registration searches. Elmwood Property Management, Riverside Investment Solutions, and Gomez Family Trust Services. Can you tell me what services these companies provide? Those are legitimate investment vehicles designed to maximize your portfolio returns while minimizing tax implications. The lie came so smoothly, delivered with such professional authority, that for a moment I almost doubted my own research. This was exactly how she'd manipulated me for years, with confident assertions delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. "Interesting," I said, pulling out Peter's research from the county clerk's office, because according to state and federal business registration databases, none of these companies exist. They're not registered anywhere. But somehow, they've received over $200,000 from my inheritance accounts.
Carmen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Maybe there's been some kind of administrative error in the database system. Administrative error? I laughed, and it came out harder than I'd intended. Carmen, the address listed for Elmwood Property Management is this house. Riverside Investment Solutions is registered to your apartment complex. Should I keep going? Jake finally spoke up, his voice tight. Brittany, I think you're misunderstanding some complex financial structures. These kinds of trust arrangements are common in estate planning. Jake, I visited a tax attorney yesterday, Leonard Walsh. He's been practicing financial law for 20 years, and he told me that what you've all been doing is called money laundering, federal crime, prison time. The room went completely silent except for the sound of something boiling over on the stove. Victoria turned off the burner without looking away from me. You went to a lawyer. Victoria's voice was ice cold now, all pretense of maternal concern gone. Without discussing it with the family first? I went to a lawyer because my own family has stolen nearly $1 million from me and forged my signature on legal documents. Did you really think I wouldn't notice eventually? We didn't steal anything, Nina said, speaking up for the first time. We were managing assets that would have been sitting in low-yield accounts while you were too sick to make rational financial decisions. Managing assets? I pulled out the property improvement permits. By renovating your own homes with my inheritance money? Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. Those improvements increased the overall value of family assets. Everything we did was designed to preserve and grow the estate for everyone's benefit. Everyone's benefit? Victoria, I've been living in a one-bedroom apartment, driving a 15-year-old car, and buying generic groceries while you've been living like millionaires on my parents' life insurance money. Your parents left that money to take care of the entire family, not just you. They wouldn't have wanted you to hoard it while the rest of us struggled. The audacity was breathtaking. They'd convinced themselves that stealing my inheritance was somehow morally justified, that I was being selfish by expecting to have access to my own money. Struggled? I looked around the room at the luxury electronics, designer clothes, and expensive home improvements. Which one of you has been struggling exactly? You don't understand the financial pressures of adult life. Real estate investments, business development, estate planning, these things require capital and strategic thinking. Strategic thinking? Like creating fake companies and forging my signature? Victoria slammed her hand on the table, making everyone jump. Enough. Brittany, you're clearly not thinking rationally. The stress of your illness has affected your judgment, and now you're making wild accusations that could damage this entire family. Damage this family? I started laughing, and once I started, I couldn't stop. Victoria, this family damaged itself when you decided to throw a party with my inheritance money while hoping I'd die quickly enough that nobody would notice. How dare you? Carmen said, standing up from her chair. How dare you accuse us of wanting you to die? We've been nothing but supportive through your entire illness. Supportive? I pulled out the fake medical report. Is this what you call supportive? Creating false medical records to justify why I was too sick to manage my own affairs? The color drained from Victoria's face as she recognized the document. Where did you get that? I found it in your office along with all the bank statements showing where my inheritance went. Did you really think I'd never recover enough to ask questions? Tyler, who'd been silent throughout this confrontation, finally looked up from his gaming device. Are you all going to get in trouble? The innocence of the question hung in the air like a bomb. Here was a teenage boy who'd been enjoying college funds and expensive electronics, suddenly realizing that the adults in his life might have been committing crimes to fund his lifestyle.
Victoria's voice became dangerously quiet. Brittany, I think you should leave now. You're obviously not well enough to have this kind of stressful conversation, and you're upsetting Tyler. I'm not going anywhere until someone explains to me how nearly $1 million disappeared from accounts that legally belong to me. Fine, Victoria said, her composure finally shattering completely. You want the truth? Here's the truth. Your parents left that money to take care of their family, not to fund your extended pity party about being sick. We used that money to improve our lives, to make investments, to secure our futures. And yes, we hoped you'd get better, but we also had to plan for the possibility that you wouldn't. So you spent my inheritance betting on my death. We spent family money taking care of family business while you were too sick and too selfish to think about anyone but yourself. As I packed up my documents and prepared to leave Victoria's house for the last time that I knew would be the last time, I realized that confronting them hadn't been about giving them a chance to come clean. It had been about confirming what I already knew. They felt completely justified in what they'd done, and they'd never voluntarily return a penny. Which meant it was time to let the federal government handle the conversation for me. 2 days after the disastrous family dinner, I was sitting in Leonard Walsh's office preparing to file formal complaints with the FBI and IRS when his assistant knocked on the door with an urgent message. There was a woman in the lobby who claimed to have information about my case and insisted on speaking with me immediately.
She says her name is Margaret Sullivan, and she used to work for your Aunt Victoria, the assistant explained. She seems very nervous, but says what she knows could be important. Margaret Sullivan turned out to be a small, nervous woman in her early 60s with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been carrying a heavy secret for too long. She clutched a worn leather briefcase like it contained her life savings. "Miss Gomez," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I saw the news about your family on the local Facebook community groups. People are talking about some kind of financial investigation. I couldn't sleep last night because I know things I should have reported months ago." Walsh gestured for her to sit down. "Mrs. Sullivan, anything you share with us will be treated with complete confidentiality, unless you choose to make it part of an official statement." Margaret nodded and opened her briefcase with shaking hands. "I worked as Victoria's personal assistant for 3 years, up until last month when I finally couldn't stand what I was seeing anymore. I quit, but I kept copies of everything because I knew someday someone would need to see the truth." She pulled out a thick folder of documents that made my evidence collection amateur by comparison. Bank statements, email printouts, handwritten notes, even audio recordings on old cassette tapes. "Victoria didn't just steal your inheritance, Miss Gomez. She's been running this operation on other people too. Elderly clients, sick relatives, anyone vulnerable enough to sign power of attorney documents." My blood turned cold. "Other people?" "At least 6 that I know of, maybe more." Margaret spread out a chart she'd created, showing names, amounts, and dates. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, 83 years old, dementia diagnosis. Victoria convinced her family she needed professional estate management. $250,000 gone. Mr. Robert Chen, 79, recovering from a stroke. $300,000 disappeared into the same fake companies she used for your money. Walsh leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you saying that Mrs. Victoria was running a systematic elder abuse operation?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. She targeted people who were sick, confused, or isolated from their families. She'd offer to help with complex financial matters, get them to sign power of attorney documents, and then systematically drain their accounts." Margaret pulled out a composition notebook filled with handwritten entries.
I kept a log of everything I saw. The fake medical reports weren't just for you, Miss Gomez. She had a whole network of people who'd create whatever documentation she needed. Doctors, nurses, even a social worker who'd write reports about patients being incompetent to manage their affairs. A network? I felt sick to my stomach. Dr. Richard Hayworth was just one of them. There's also Dr. Jennifer Mitchell, Dr. Carlos Rodriguez, Nurse Patricia Williams. All of them would create false medical assessments for a fee. Victoria paid them through those shell companies she created. Walsh was taking furious notes. Mrs. Sullivan, how long has this been going on? At least 5 years that I know of, maybe longer. She started small with just a few elderly neighbors who needed help with their finances, but once she realized how easy it was and how much money she could make, it became her full-time business. Margaret pulled out a manila envelope. This is what finally made me quit. She asked me to help her create a false death certificate for Mrs. Patterson, said the old woman was taking too long to die naturally, and they needed to accelerate the insurance claims. The room went completely silent. Walsh's pen stopped moving. I felt like I couldn't breathe. She wanted you to forge a death certificate? She had someone lined up to do it. All I had to do was deliver the paperwork and collect the payment. That's when I realized this wasn't just financial fraud anymore. This was something much darker. Margaret opened another folder, this one filled with life insurance policies. She wasn't just stealing from people, Miss Gomez. She was taking out life insurance policies on her victims without their knowledge. Small amounts spread across different companies so nobody would notice the pattern. When her victims died, she'd collect the payouts along with whatever was left of their savings. I thought I was going to vomit. She took out life insurance policies on me? Margaret nodded miserably. 3 policies, $50,000 each, with different companies, all listing her as the beneficiary for estate management purposes. She filed the applications using your forged signature and fake medical reports showing that your cancer was terminal. So she wasn't just hoping I'd die, I said slowly, the full horror of it sinking in. She was financially invested in my death. All of her victims, Miss Gomez, Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Chen, Mr. Williams, who died last year, Mrs. Rodriguez, who passed in the spring. Victoria collected life insurance payouts on all of them. Walsh looked up from his notes, his face grave. Mrs. Sullivan, what you're describing isn't just fraud. This is organized criminal activity, potentially murder for financial gain. That's why I finally had to come forward, Margaret said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. When I heard that Miss Gomez had survived her cancer and was asking questions, I knew Victoria would panic. And when a Victoria panics, people have a way of having accidents. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My miraculous recovery from cancer wasn't just an inconvenience to Victoria's financial plans. It was a threat to an entire criminal operation that had been running for years.
Margaret, I asked, my voice shaking, the other victims, the ones who died, were their deaths natural? I don't know for certain. But Mrs. Patterson was getting better before she suddenly got worse. Mr. Chen was recovering from his stroke until he had a setback that killed him. Mr. Williams was supposed to be discharged from the hospital when he suddenly developed complications. Margaret pulled out her final piece of evidence, a small digital recorder. I started secretly recording my conversations with Victoria after Mrs. Patterson died. I was getting suspicious about how many of her clients seemed to take sudden turns for the worse right when their finances were completely drained. She pressed play, and Victoria's voice filled the office, clear and unmistakable. The Chen situation needs to be resolved quickly. He's asking too many questions about his account balances, and his son is starting to get involved. Dr. Rodriguez says he can arrange for some medication adjustments that would solve our problem permanently. Walsh stopped the recording. Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to understand something very important. What you've just shared with us is evidence of multiple federal crimes, including conspiracy, fraud,
elder abuse, and potentially murder. Are you prepared to make this information available to the federal investigators?" Margaret nodded firmly. "I should have come forward months ago. How many people died because I was too scared to speak up?" As I sat there listening to evidence of my aunt's systematic murder and theft operation, I realized that my inheritance was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Victoria hadn't just stolen from me. She'd been running a kill-for-profit scheme that had been claiming victims for years. And now that I'd survived against all odds, I wasn't just a witness to financial fraud. I was the one person who could expose a serial killer who'd been hiding behind the respectable facade of estate management services. The stakes had just gotten infinitely higher, and I was no longer just fighting for my inheritance. I was fighting to make sure that Victoria never got the chance to murder anyone else for money. The morning after Margaret Sullivan's revelations, Leonard Walsh called me at 7 a.m. with news that would change everything. The FBI had moved faster than anyone expected, and what they'd found during their preliminary investigation made my family's theft look like petty crime compared to the massive federal conspiracy they'd uncovered. "Britney, I need you to get down to the federal building immediately. Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division wants to meet with you, and she's bringing some information that's going to shock even me." Agent Martinez was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made you trust her instantly. She'd spread dozens of documents across a conference room table that looked like a crime board from a television show, complete with photographs, financial charts, and what appeared to be surveillance footage. "Ms. Gomez, what your family did to you was terrible, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. In the past 18 hours, we've uncovered what appears to be a multi-state elder abuse ring that's been operating for at least 7 years, with your Aunt Victoria as one of the primary architects." She pointed to a map of the southwestern United States dotted with red pins. 43 victims across 5 states. Conservative estimate of $12 million in stolen assets. At least 15 suspicious deaths that we're now investigating as potential homicides. I sat down heavily, trying to process numbers that seemed impossible. $12 million? Victoria wasn't working alone. She had partners in Phoenix, Las Vegas, Denver, and Austin. They'd share victim information, refer clients to each other, even coordinate their fake medical networks to make their operations look more legitimate. Agent Martinez pulled out a thick folder labeled Gomez Victoria Financial Records. Inside were bank statements that made my stolen inheritance look like pocket change. Accounts in multiple states, offshore holdings, investments in real estate, luxury vehicles, and businesses I'd never heard of. "Your aunt has been living like a millionaire for years, Miss Gomez, while reporting annual income of $35,000 to the IRS. The tax evasion alone carries a potential sentence of 20 years in federal prison." She showed me photographs of properties I didn't recognize. A beachfront condo in Florida, a mountain cabin in Colorado, a luxury apartment in downtown Phoenix. All purchased with money stolen from elderly victims who trusted Victoria to manage their final years with dignity. "But here's what's really going to destroy her," Agent Martinez said, pulling out a different folder. "The IRS doesn't just audit people randomly. Someone reported your family's suspicious spending patterns, and that triggered a comprehensive financial investigation that went back 7 years." Someone reported them? A nurse named Patricia Williams. She was part of Victoria's network of corrupt medical professionals, but she got scared after Mrs. Eleanor Patterson died. Williams thought Victoria was moving too fast, taking too many risks, and she was worried about getting caught up in her murder investigation.
She pulled out surveillance photographs that made my blood run cold. Pictures of Victoria meeting with people I didn't recognize in parking lots, handing over envelopes of cash, sitting in restaurants with men who looked like they belonged in movies about organized crime. "We've been watching your aunt for months, Ms. Gomez, long before you discovered your stolen inheritance. What we found was that Victoria had gotten involved with some very dangerous people to help her expand her operation." Dangerous people?
money launderers, primarily, people who specialize in making stolen assets disappear into untraceable investments, but also forgers, corrupt medical professionals, and at least 2 individuals with connections to organized crime families in Nevada. Agent Martinez opened her laptop and showed me financial records that looked like something from a spy movie. Transactions in the Cayman Islands, shell companies in Delaware, investment accounts in Switzerland. Your aunt wasn't just stealing from elderly people, Ms. Gomez. She was running a sophisticated international money laundering operation. The $12 million we've traced is probably a fraction of what actually went through her network. I felt like I was in a nightmare. The woman who'd made me lemon chicken and held my hand during chemotherapy treatments had apparently been running a criminal empire that spanned multiple countries. "There's more," Agent Martinez said grimly. "Remember Dr. Richard Hayworth, the fake doctor whose name was on your fraudulent medical report? We found him." She showed me a mugshot of a middle-aged man I'd never seen before. Real name is Richard Hartwell, former medical student who was kicked out of school for falsifying research data. He's been creating fake medical records for Victoria's network for 3 years, but he's also been doing work for other criminal organizations. Other organizations? Insurance fraud rings, disability scam operations, even some cases involving workers' compensation fraud. Hartwell has created hundreds of false medical reports, and we've connected him to at least 6 deaths that are now being investigated as homicides. Agent Martinez pulled out the most damning piece of evidence yet, a ledger written in Victoria's handwriting that Margaret Sullivan had secretly photographed before quitting her job. This is Victoria's personal record of what she called her client portfolio: names, amounts stolen, dates of death, insurance payouts received. She kept track of everything like it was a legitimate business. I looked at the ledger and saw my own name listed under active cases, high priority. Next to my name was my cancer diagnosis date, my prognosis, and a projected date of death that had passed 3 months ago. In the margin, Victoria had written, "Taking too long. Consider intervention." "Intervention?" I whispered. "We believe Victoria was planning to have you killed, Ms. Gomez. Your recovery from cancer wasn't just inconvenient. It was threatening to expose her entire operation. We found communications between Victoria and her associates discussing permanent solutions to the Britney problem." Agent Martinez showed me text messages that had been recovered from Victoria's phone. Messages about reliable people who could handle complications and make problems disappear permanently. The dates on the messages corresponded exactly with my improving health reports. The room started spinning. My own aunt had literally hired someone to murder me because I was inconveniently surviving cancer? "Ms. Gomez, I want you to understand something very important," Agent Martinez said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not just a victim of financial fraud anymore. You're a federal witness in a murder conspiracy case that involves organized crime, international money laundering, and a systematic killing operation that's been claiming victims for years." She handed me a business card and a thick envelope. "This is your new contact information, and inside this envelope are instructions for your protection. As of this morning, you're in federal protective custody until we can arrest everyone involved in this operation." Protective custody? Victoria, Carmen, Jake, Nina, and at least 12 other people are being arrested simultaneously this afternoon. But we have reason to believe there are still people out there who consider you a threat to their operations, people who won't be satisfied until you're dead. As Agent Martinez escorted me out of the federal building toward an unmarked car that would take me to a safe location, I realized that discovering my stolen inheritance had exposed something far more sinister than family greed. I had accidentally stumbled into a criminal empire that had been murdering elderly people for profit. And now my survival had made me the key witness in a federal investigation that could send dozens of people to prison for life. The girl who just wanted to understand where her inheritance had gone was now the most important person in a case that would dismantle an international murder-for-profit operation. From the safety of a federal safe house in downtown Phoenix, I watched the evening news as my entire family's world collapsed in real time. The coordinated arrest had begun at exactly 3 p.m., and by 6 p.m., every major news station was covering what reporters were calling the largest elder abuse conspiracy in federal law enforcement history. The footage was surreal, Victoria being let out of her house in handcuffs, her perfect composure finally cracking as FBI agents carried boxes of evidence past the cameras. Carmen screaming at reporters from the back of a police car, Jake trying to cover his face with his jacket as federal agents searched his downtown loft, Nina sobbing as they arrested her at her workplace, her coworkers watching in shock as their colleague was led away for conspiracy to commit murder.
Agent Martinez sat beside me on the safe house couch, providing commentary as we watched my family's public humiliation unfold on television. The timing had to be perfect, she explained. We couldn't risk any of them communicating with each other or destroying evidence once they realized we were closing in. What about the others, the people in different states? Simultaneous raids in Phoenix, Las Vegas, Denver, and Austin. 47 arrests total, including your family. The corrupt medical professionals, the money launderers, the document forgers, we got all of them. On screen, the news showed Dr. Richard Hartwell being arrested at a medical clinic in Scottsdale, where he'd been working under yet another false identity. The reporter mentioned that he was wanted in connection with at least 15 suspicious deaths across 4 states. How did you coordinate all of this without anyone finding out? Agent Martinez smiled grimly. We've been planning this operation for 6 months. Your family's theft of your inheritance was actually the smallest part of our investigation, but it gave us the final piece of evidence we needed to prove the conspiracy charges. The news switched to footage from the Las Vegas arrests, showing a woman in her 50s being let out of a luxury casino hotel. The reporter identified her as Sandra Morrison, described as Victoria's primary partner in the elder abuse ring. Morrison was the one who taught your aunt how to expand beyond individual thefts into systematic exploitation. She's been running similar operations in Nevada for over a decade. We estimate she's personally responsible for stealing over $8 million from elderly victims. My phone, which had been given to me by the FBI and monitored all calls, rang with an unknown number. Agent Martinez nodded for me to answer. Britney? The voice was shaky, scared. It took me a moment to recognize Tyler, my teenage nephew. Tyler, where are you? I'm at school still. The police came to my house and arrested everyone. My mom, my grandma Victoria, everyone. They won't tell me what's happening, and I don't have anywhere to go. My heart broke for him. Tyler was just a kid who'd been enjoying luxuries he didn't know were purchased with blood money. Tyler, you're going to be okay. This isn't your fault. But what did they do, Brittany? The news is saying something about murder and stealing money from old people? That can't be true, right? Agent Martinez was listening to the conversation and shook her head when I looked at her questioningly. I couldn't tell Tyler the truth. Not yet. Not while he was alone and scared. Tyler, right now I need you to go to your school counselor's office and stay there until someone comes to get you. The FBI is going to make sure you're taken care of. Are you in trouble too? Everyone's saying you're the one who got them arrested. The pain in his voice was devastating. This boy had been like a little brother to me, and now he was learning that his entire family were criminals and that I was the one who'd exposed them. Tyler, I love you, and none of this changes that. But your family did some very bad things to a lot of people, and I couldn't let them keep hurting others. After I hung up, Agent Martinez informed me that Tyler would be placed with temporary foster care until extended family from his father's side could be located. He's a minor, and he had no knowledge of the criminal activities. He'll be protected from any legal consequences. The evening news continued with more devastating revelations. The IRS had frozen all assets connected to the criminal network, including Victoria's house, Carmen's Mercedes, Jake's loft, and even Tyler's college fund. Everything purchased with stolen money was being seized as evidence. What happens to the victims' families? The people who lost their loved ones? That's where your role becomes crucial, Agent Martinez said, pulling out a thick folder.
We need you to testify not just about your own case, but about the entire pattern of exploitation. Your survival and your investigation are what allowed us to connect all these cases together. She showed me victim impact statements from families across multiple states. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's daughter describing how her mother had gone from independent and sharp to confused and frightened in a matter of months. Mr. Robert Chen's son explaining how his father had been recovering well from his stroke until he suddenly developed complications that the hospital couldn't explain. These families deserve justice, and your testimony is going to help them get it. The news switched to financial coverage, with reporters explaining how the IRS investigation had uncovered a sophisticated tax evasion scheme. The defendants failed to report millions of dollars in income while living lavish lifestyles, the financial reporter explained. The tax penalties alone could result in decades of federal prison time, even without the murder and fraud charges. My phone rang again. This time it was Leonard Walsh, my attorney. Brittany, I'm watching the news coverage, and I have to tell you, what you've accomplished here goes far beyond recovering your stolen inheritance. You've exposed a criminal network that's been destroying families for years. I still can't believe how big this was. I just wanted to know where my parents' money went. And in finding that answer, you've probably saved dozens of future victims. The federal prosecutors are estimating that this network was on track to steal another $20 million over the next few years. Walsh explained that the federal seizure of assets would eventually result in a victim compensation fund. While it might take years to sort out, the families of Victoria's victims would eventually recover at least some of what was stolen from their loved ones.
What about me? Do I get my inheritance back? Every penny, plus interest, plus damages. The government is treating you as both a victim and a key witness, which means you'll be compensated not just for your financial losses, but for the emotional trauma and the risk you've taken by coming forward. As the evening progressed, more details emerged about the scope of the criminal network, international money laundering charges that could add decades to prison sentences, RICO charges that would allow prosecutors to seize assets across multiple states, conspiracy charges that made every member of the network liable for every crime committed by any other member. The local news ran interviews with neighbors and community members who'd known Victoria for years. She seemed like such a caring person, one neighbor said. She was always helping elderly people in the community with their finances. I never would have suspected. That caring facade was exactly how she'd gained access to her victims. Victoria had built a reputation as a trustworthy community member who helped vulnerable people navigate complex financial situations. In reality, she'd been using that trust to identify and exploit her targets. Agent Martinez received a call during the late evening news coverage. After hanging up, she turned to me with a satisfied expression. Tony Castellanos, the hitman Victoria hired to kill you, just agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's providing details about other jobs Victoria hired him for, including at least 3 deaths we hadn't connected to her network. As I sat in that safe house, watching my family's criminal empire crumble on live television, I realized that my decision to investigate my stolen inheritance had triggered one of the largest federal criminal takedowns in years. The girl who'd been too sick and too trusting to ask questions about her family's sudden wealth had become the key witness in dismantling a murder-for-profit operation that had been destroying lives across multiple states for nearly a decade. 18 months after the arrests, I sat in the witness box of Federal District Court in Phoenix, facing the people who had once been my family. The trial had taken over a year to prepare, with federal prosecutors building cases against 47 defendants across multiple jurisdictions. Today was the day I would finally confront Victoria face to face and tell the world exactly what she had done. Victoria looked nothing like the confident woman who had once manipulated my medical crisis for financial gain. Prison had aged her dramatically. Her silver hair was now completely gray and unkempt, her expensive clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her diminished frame. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine fear. Carmen sat beside her, equally transformed by 18 months of federal detention.
The glamorous lifestyle funded by stolen inheritance money had been replaced by the harsh reality of awaiting trial for conspiracy to commit murder. Jake looked broken, his confident businessman facade completely shattered. Nina couldn't even look at me, staring at her hands throughout my testimony. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez, had prepared me thoroughly for this moment. Ms. Gomez, please tell the court how you first discovered that your inheritance was missing. For the next 6 hours, I walked the jury through the entire story. The cancer diagnosis that made me vulnerable, the fake medical reports designed to justify stealing my money, the systematic pattern of financial exploitation that had been refined over years of targeting elderly victims, the discovery that my own survival had inconveniently disrupted a murder-for-profit operation that had been destroying lives across multiple states for nearly a decade. 18 months after the arrests, I sat in the witness box of Federal District Court in Phoenix, facing the people who had once been my family. The trial had taken over a year to prepare, with federal prosecutors building cases against 47 defendants across multiple jurisdictions. Today was the day I would finally confront Victoria face to face and tell the world exactly what she had done. Victoria looked nothing like the confident woman who had once manipulated my medical crisis for financial gain. Prison had aged her dramatically. Her silver hair was now completely gray and unkempt, her expensive clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her diminished frame. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine fear. Carmen sat beside her, equally transformed by 18 months of federal detention. The glamorous lifestyle funded by stolen inheritance money had been replaced by the harsh reality of awaiting trial for conspiracy to commit murder. Jake looked broken, his confident businessman facade completely shattered. Nina couldn't even look at me, staring at her hands throughout my testimony. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez, had prepared me thoroughly for this moment. Ms. Gomez, please tell the court how you first discovered that your inheritance was missing. For the next 6 hours, I walked the jury through the entire story: the cancer diagnosis that made me vulnerable, the fake medical reports designed to justify stealing my money, the systematic pattern of financial exploitation that had been refined over years of targeting elderly victims, the discovery that my own survival had inconveniently disrupted a murder-for-profit operation that had been destroying lives across multiple states for nearly a decade. Ms. Gomez, Rodriguez continued, did there come a time when you learned that the defendants had taken out life insurance policies in your name without your consent? Yes, 3 policies, each for $50,000, listing Victoria as the beneficiary. The applications were filed with forged medical reports, stating that my cancer was terminal when my actual doctors were cautiously optimistic about my recovery. I testified about Margaret Sullivan's revelations, about the network of corrupt medical professionals, about the fake businesses used to launder stolen money. With each piece of evidence, I watched Victoria's defense attorney's confidence crumble. Her legal team had tried to portray this as a family misunderstanding, a case of poor communication during a medical crisis. But the evidence of systematic criminal enterprise was overwhelming. The most devastating moment came when Rodriguez played the audio recording of Victoria discussing permanent solutions to my inconvenient survival. Victoria's own voice filled the courtroom. The chin situation needs to be resolved quickly. Dr. Rodriguez says he can arrange for some medication adjustments that would solve our problem permanently. Several jury members looked visibly shocked. Victoria's mother, my great-aunt Helen, who had attended every day of the trial in support of her daughter, finally broke down in tears. During cross-examination, Victoria's defense attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive family member seeking revenge for being excluded from financial decisions. Ms. Gomez, isn't it true that you were angry about not being consulted about investment strategies during your illness? I wasn't angry about investment strategies. I was angry about discovering that my family had forged my signature on legal documents, created fake medical reports, and hired someone to murder me when I became inconveniently healthy. The defense attorney couldn't recover from that response. The prosecution's case included testimony from 43 other victims or their surviving family members. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's daughter described watching her mother deteriorate from an independent woman to a confused, frightened shell of herself in a matter of months. Mr. Robert Chin's son testified about his father's mysterious setback that killed him just as he was preparing to question Victoria about missing funds.
The most powerful testimony came from Tony Castellanos, the hitman Victoria had hired to kill me. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided detailed information about 5 other murders he committed at Victoria's request over the past 3 years. She paid me $25,000 to make Britney Gomez disappear, he testified, said the cancer patient was taking too long to die naturally and was starting to ask too many questions. Victoria wanted it to look like a relapse, something that wouldn't raise suspicions. When Castellanos testified about murdering Mrs. Patterson with the contaminated insulin injection, Victoria finally broke down completely. Her carefully maintained Innocence Act dissolved into hysterical sobbing as the full scope of her crimes was laid bare. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all defendants. Federal conspiracy charges, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, elder abuse, and, for Victoria specifically, 5 counts of murder for hire. Judge Patricia Williams, no relation to the nurse who had originally blown the whistle, delivered the sentences with cold precision. Victoria, life in federal prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 127 years for the financial crimes. Carmen, 45 years. Jake, 38 years. Nina, 32 years. Even with good behavior, none of them would see freedom again. The court finds that this was not a case of family members making poor financial decisions during a medical crisis, Judge Williams stated. This was a systematic criminal enterprise designed to exploit the most vulnerable members of our society for financial gain, culminating in multiple murders when victims became inconvenient. She continued, "The defendants showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain they caused, and attempted to manipulate the legal system just as they manipulated their victims. The sentences reflect not just the financial harm, but the betrayal of trust and the taking of innocent lives." As the defendants were led away in shackles, Victoria looked at me one final time. Instead of the hatred I expected, I saw something that looked almost like relief. After years of living a lie, maintaining elaborate deceptions, and carrying the weight of multiple murders, perhaps there was some peace in finally being held accountable. The civil restitution phase had already been resolved months earlier. The federal government had seized over $15 million in assets from the criminal network, establishing a victim compensation fund that would provide full restitution to all affected families. I received not only my complete inheritance, but additional damages for emotional trauma and punitive compensation that totaled nearly $2 million. But the money wasn't what mattered most to me as I walked out of that federal courthouse. What mattered was knowing that Victoria would never hurt another vulnerable person, that Carmen would never manipulate another family member, that the network of corrupt medical professionals would never create another fake death certificate. The girl who had been too trusting and too grateful had become a woman who understood that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones most willing to destroy you for personal gain. As I stood on the courthouse steps, reporters shouting questions I didn't want to answer, I realized that surviving cancer had been the easy part. The real survival had been learning to trust my own perceptions, to question people who claim to have my best interests at heart, and to understand that family titles don't excuse criminal behavior. Justice had been served, but more importantly, future victims had been protected from a criminal enterprise that had been perfecting the art of murder for profit for nearly a decade. 3 years after the trial ended, I stood on the front porch of the house I'd just purchased with my recovered inheritance. A modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew my story unless I chose to share it. The morning sun filtered through oak trees my parents would have loved, casting gentle shadows across a garden I was learning to tend without the weight of other people's expectations. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, now 21 and finishing his junior year at Arizona State University. His message included a photo of him graduating from the Dean's List ceremony, smiling broadly in his cap and gown. "Thank you for never giving up on me, Aunt Brittany."
I know this hasn't been easy, but you saved my life too. Tyler had been the hardest part of all of this. Watching an innocent kid struggle to understand how the adults who'd raised him had been serial killers. After the trial, he'd moved in with his father's family in Oregon, but we'd maintained a relationship built on honesty rather than the toxic family loyalty that had nearly destroyed both our lives. I helped pay for his college tuition, not out of obligation or manipulation, but because he was genuinely working to build a life separate from the crimes that had funded his childhood. "I'm proud of you," I texted back. "Your parents' choices don't define who you become." The irony wasn't lost on me that Tyler was attending university with money that had originally been stolen from me, then recovered through federal asset seizure, then given back to me, and was now being used to help him escape the legacy of his family's crimes. Sometimes justice works in circles rather than straight lines. Rachel called when I was making coffee, her voice bright with the kind of genuine happiness that had taken me years to recognize again. "I saw the news about the Victim Compensation Fund reaching full distribution. How does it feel knowing everyone got their money back?" "It feels like the right ending," I said, settling into the kitchen chair I'd positioned to catch the morning light. Mrs. Patterson's daughter was able to buy back her mother's house from the people who'd purchased it after Victoria stole it.
Mr. Chen's son used his father's recovered money to start a nonprofit helping elderly people avoid financial scams. The Victim Compensation Fund had ultimately distributed over $18 million to affected families, money recovered not just from the criminal network's assets, but from penalties and interest charges that had accumulated during the federal investigation. Every family had been made financially whole, though no amount of money could restore the lives that had been lost to Victoria's murder-for-profit operation. "What about you? Are you really okay?" It was a question Rachel asked me regularly, and I'd learned to give her honest answers rather than the polite reassurances I'd once used to make other people comfortable with my pain. "I'm learning to trust my own judgment again," I said. "That's harder than recovering from cancer was. Cancer was something that happened to me. The family betrayal was something I participated in by ignoring red flags and making excuses for people who didn't deserve them." The psychological recovery had been more complex than the financial recovery. It had taken 2 years of therapy to understand that my family's exploitation hadn't been my fault, but that recognizing the warning signs and trusting my instincts was my responsibility going forward. I'd learned to identify emotional manipulation, financial red flags, and the difference between genuine care and performative concern. More importantly, I'd learned that being suspicious of people who asked for trust wasn't cynicism, it was wisdom. My work now reflected this hard-earned understanding. I spent 3 days a week as a victim advocate with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, helping other people navigate the aftermath of financial fraud and elder abuse. The rest of my time was devoted to speaking at law enforcement conferences, training social workers to recognize exploitation patterns, and working with lawmakers to strengthen protections for vulnerable populations. "The hardest cases are always the family ones," I told Rachel. "When strangers steal from you, it's clearly criminal. When family members do it, victims spend years wondering if they're being ungrateful or suspicious for asking questions." Last month, I testified before a Senate committee about strengthening federal penalties for elder abuse. The committee chair, Senator Patricia Morales, had thanked me for my courage in exposing a criminal network that had preyed on the most trusting relationships in our society. But it hadn't felt like courage at the time. It had felt like survival. The doorbell rang, interrupting my call with Rachel. Through the window, I could see a young woman about my age, holding a folder of documents, looking nervous but determined. I recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look I'd worn when I first walked into Leonard Walsh's office with evidence of my family's betrayal. "Rachel, I need to go. Someone's here who might need help." The woman's name was Jessica Martinez, and she suspected her stepfather was stealing from her elderly mother who had dementia. She'd found bank statements showing large withdrawals, property transfers she didn't understand, and medical reports that didn't match her mother's actual condition. "I've been making excuses for him for months," Jessica said, tears in her eyes as she spread documents across my kitchen table. "He says Mom signed everything willingly, that she's just confused about what she agreed to, but something feels wrong, and I don't know if I'm being paranoid or if I should trust my instincts." "Trust your instincts," I said, looking at bank statements that showed a pattern I recognized all too well, "and let me help you document everything before we called the authorities."
As Jessica and I worked through her mother's financial records, I realized that my story hadn't ended with Victoria's life sentence. It had evolved into something larger, a responsibility to help other people recognize exploitation before it destroyed their families and claimed more lives. The girl who had once been grateful for scraps of attention from people who were systematically robbing her had become a woman who helped others understand that questioning authority figures wasn't disrespectful. It was necessary. Later that evening, after Jessica had left with a referral to a financial crimes attorney and a clear plan for protecting her mother, I sat in my garden as the sun set over the mountains my parents had loved. The cancer that had made me vulnerable to Victoria's scheme was now 5 years in remission. The inheritance that had been stolen and recovered was providing security and purpose rather than just luxury. But more importantly, the voice inside me that had whispered, "Something isn't right," during those early months of exploitation, had grown strong enough to trust. That voice had saved my life, exposed a murder-for-profit operation, and was now helping other people recognize when their trust was being weaponized against them. If you've ever found yourself in a situation where family members or trusted friends are making financial decisions for you without your input, making you feel guilty for asking questions, or benefiting from your generosity while claiming you're too emotional or sick to understand complex matters, trust that inner voice that's telling you something isn't right. Your instincts aren't paranoia, your questions aren't disrespectful, and your survival might depend on your willingness to investigate when people who claim to love you are treating you like you're disposable. Sometimes the people who know you best are the ones most capable of exploiting what they know, but sometimes, if you're brave enough to ask the hard questions and strong enough to face difficult answers, you can expose the truth before it's too late to fight back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.